regulation, fighting wasteful spending, and standing up for our rights as individuals against the ever-encroaching cold, dead hand of government that wants to take all of our money and tell us what to do with it in our lives. So if you're not a member already, I hope that you'll join. I'm very excited to be able to say that we are launching an autonomous branch in West Australia focusing on West Australian issues of spending and regulation soon. So if anyone's interested in getting involved in that, please let me know afterwards. So before I start on my speech, I also want to acknowledge the fact that today I was at the Australian New Zealand Students for Liberty West Australian Conference, and I want to thank Ahmed, Bianca, and everyone else was involved in doing that, and what an amazing conference it was. And we are lucky in how vibrant the Liberty community is at the moment. 10 years ago, if you were a young student interested in Liberty, there were so few outcomes for you. So few places for you to join, and now that we have SFL working with Mancal, and I also want to acknowledge Ron Manners from Mancal and the amazing work he's been doing. And I think many And so here in Perth, where we have Mancal, we now have an amazing Students for Liberty team. We have people like Joe Nova and David Evans doing an amazing job fighting for freedom against some other big government policies here, and many, many other people. What I wanted to talk about today, which is some of the more sort of sobering talk, are the challenges that we face to liberty in the West, because we are potentially looking at a relatively dark era for us and how we can avoid this. It's not all bad though. If you want to look at human history, we're in a pretty good point. Poverty around the world has declined in the last couple of decades because of economic freedom, faster than at any time in human history. To use one example, due to market reforms in China, in the last 30 years, 680 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Just think about this, 680 million people. In 1980, 28% of China's population was under $1.25 a day. From 28%, it's now gone down to 0.5%. Why? Because of the market reforms that they've implemented. Around the world, extreme poverty has fallen from 37% to 13%. Even though the world's population has grown by 2 billion people, there are over 1 billion fewer people in extreme poverty. In fact, in the last 26 years, extreme poverty rate has fallen from over 1 in 3 in the world to under 1 in 10. Just think about that. From over 30% of people living in extreme poverty, it's now under 10%. This, caused by global free trade, free markets, and has led to an amazing human flourishing. Even for those of us in the West who have been relatively fortunate, we've seen everything improve. The free market has meant that basic necessities of life, as well as luxury goods, and things that were luxury goods, are now commonplace. If you want to look at something similar, TVs. TVs have fallen. To buy colour TV, in 1980, it cost you 60 hours of work. Now it's 6 hours. To buy a washing machine, it used to be 67 hours. Now it's 30 hours. You look at buying, if you get an iPhone or an Android phone, compare all the things that are in it to just 15 years ago. Buying a radio, a Walkman, a Mac, all these programs. It would have cost you tens and tens of thousands of dollars. We see that the fall of the Berlin Wall liberated literally hundreds of millions of people from a life of almost slavery. And these events have not actually been that recent. Those of us who know about that, who are interested in climate science, would know the hockey stick scam. But there actually was a hockey stick in human history. The hockey stick was the fact that for almost all of human history, up until 200 years ago, people were on $3 a day. You look at it, it was flat line. 2000 BC to 1700 AD, it was a flat line of $3 a person a day in today's terms. It's now gone up to $125 a day. Just imagine that, how amazing that has been. 200 years ago, global life expectancy at birth was just 26 years. Now it's 71. If you're the poorest person in Australia, you are now eating better than European royalty did 200 years ago. Now, the big change in opinion came about in the industrial relations and through changing opinions on markets and innovation and the role of the middle class. Deidre McCluskey, one of the greatest economists I think alive at the moment, wrote about how these bourgeois virtues were so important for this. But so what caused this flourishing? Well, pretty much everything that we believe in. Small government, individual freedom, trade, capitalism, and the fact that it works. The ideology of classical liberalism, however you want to call it, of small government, was the signature philosophy of Western civilization. Sure, hints and suggestions of this were found in other cultures, but it was this distinctive thing, primarily in England and then exported to the US and other outposts, that sowed the seeds for the economic prosperity that we see today. By the Middle Ages, already many parts of Europe, especially in the West and in the UK, developed a culture friendly to property rights and trade, and this is what started it off. You had scholastic theologians arguing from a theological basis that all were created equal in God's image, and so all were treated as equal, and you had a relationship of man and the state based on this. You then had John Locke drawing on the traditions of natural law, arguing that everyone is innately endowed with natural rights. And what were these rights? They consist in the fundamental right to property, the property in yourself of life, which leads to liberty, and estates, or material goods. In the US, they changed this to a pursuit of happiness because they thought estates wasn't PC enough, funnily enough, 200 years ago. But the concept was the same. You had the case in the UK of 400 years ago. Receipts were found by archaeologists which showed a cobbler suing the Lord of the Manor because he didn't pay his bills. Equality under the law and the rule of law. So you saw the rule of law and you saw economic freedom. And even today you see that economic freedom leads to a flourishing of human rights, freedom, economic growth, living standards, equality, women's rights, life expectancy. All of these things correlate with economic freedom. And this Lockean philosophy exerted influence on the UK for generations to come and onto Australia and other countries. All these things that we take for granted, such as trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty, the rule of law, representative government, habeas corpus, free contract. These weren't a historical norm, but it's what we've seen in the last 300 years, which is what made our society flourish. Dan Hannan, who many of you would know, has written extensively on this, and far more eloquently than I could ever say. But you know, you go back and you look at England 100 years ago. You watch movies, you students watch movies from the 50s. You read books, you know, I read it growing up. And there was something specific about it, which was the concept of freedom. And this was embedded in the DNA 100 years ago. A.J.P. Taylor, a historian, I might not agree with all things about him, but he had this, in his introduction to England Between the Wars, the first two paragraphs are the most chilling things you could read. I won't read the whole thing out now, but he made the comment that until August 1914, a sensible law-abiding Englishman could pass through life and hardly notice the existence of a state beyond the post office and the police. He could live where he liked and as he liked. There was no official number or identity card. He could travel abroad or leave his country forever without a passport. He could exchange his money without restriction. He could buy goods from any country in the world on the same terms as he bought goods at home. A foreigner could spend his life in a country without a permit. Unlike the countries of the European continent, the state did not require its citizens to perform military service. He could ignore the demands of national defence. And so on and so on. And he concludes that, broadly speaking, the state acted only to help those who could not help themselves. It left the adult citizen alone. And so, what has changed? But what we saw at that time was greater than simply economic growth. It offered a flourishing of the human spirit. Self-control, as opposed to government control, offered a life of freedom with responsibility. But that responsibility enabled us to realise our dignity in peace and harmony with others. It was made a life worthy of being a human being. It was the foundation for prosperity and for progress. In the last few years, and in fact in the last century, we saw a contrary view. That of state control, offering a life of obedience, subservience and fear. Free people were not subservient. But admittedly, they weren't uncontrolled, but they controlled themselves. And when we focus the topic of this speech is liberty in the West, it was both liberty in the West in terms of Western civilization, but also in West Australia, because of all of our states, West Australia was the only one that had, in many ways, this freedom spirit. The entrepreneurs, the mining people who went out and made their own living, this Australian spirit of freedom, but on the other hand, self-responsibility and self-control, was really seen in Western Australia. This pride in accomplishment, this can-do spirit. This sort of, it's almost like the Aristotelian notion of what is the good life. Dignity, self-respect is what I would argue it is. And the loss of autonomy and the loss of responsibility that has begun to come with government oversight and control is ultimately destructive to the human spirit. We've seen now cases where things that communities used to do, the government just takes over. There were, people, 30, 40 years ago, if you lived in a rural community, you would fundraise, you would get together, you would make money. And Peter Stiller did an amazing speech on this 20 years ago, which I'm completely ripping his idea off him. And it was one of the most amazing speeches I've heard. It's all about, 40 years ago, you wanted to build a community in the country. You'd all get together, you'd raise money, and you'd build a community hall, and you'd fundraise, and you'd do lantern sales and so forth. And then the government came and said, oh, community halls are good, let's just build them all. Government built it, and then nobody ever turned up. Why? Because the community wasn't formed because you had a hall. The community was the fact that everyone got together, worked together, was engaged in civil society, and that is how a community was formed. We now have nanny-state regulations, which I'll get into a little bit more later, which just try and destroy every principle of autonomy, and just think, just do whatever we are told. But overall, the last couple of hundred years have been pretty good for us. And speaking of nanny-state regulations, by the way, if people want to have a drink while I'm talking, please go ahead and do it. I would actually take it as a win for freedom. I'm not actually going to be personally offended by it. But we're starting to see the emergence of some interesting technologies on this. But look, if you look around the world right now, these values are under attack. Liberty is challenged both domestically, where we see what's happening in our politics, but also around the world from forces of genuine evil and barbarism. Here in Australia, we're experiencing in many ways a loss of belief in our human spirit and the values of liberty that made us great. This loss of self-confidence in ourselves and in our values once has led to the rise of failed and discredited authoritarian ideologies. We see big government regulation crushing businesses, taxes hurting families, and nanny-state regulation, meaning pretty much none of us can actually go out and have a good time anymore, because as soon as we would try and find something fun to do, the government will ban it. The fact is that fundamental concepts like freedom of speech are under attack. Not just with Section 18C, which I know many people are concerned about, but with other laws on this measure. And we had a situation in QUT where hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent prosecuting two students who criticised the fact that there was a segregated room, a racially segregated room for computers. Two students were denied entry to a computer lab because it was reserved for Indigenous students. They made a comment on Facebook saying, why can't I use this, that's racist. And the human rights lobby spent hundreds of thousands of dollars prosecuting them for hate speech for it, without tax money. The fact that freedom of speech is under attack now, and isn't even considered a virtue, this is extraordinary when you look upon this in Western history. The rule of law. Someone in the US, Harry Silverdale and Alan Dershowitz, made an analysis. They went, chances are in the US, you break 3 federal laws a day. The average individual breaks 3 federal laws a day. It's pretty much the same here. Because you have bureaucrats who now want so much power that pretty much everything is illegal unless they choose otherwise, which gives them the discretion to prosecute you if they don't like you. Even the most, as they say in their book, even the most honest and informed citizen cannot predict with any reasonable assurance whether a wide range of seeming ordinary activities might be regarded by federal prosecutors as felonies. And what do we see from our political class in Australia? Despite all the gains we've made, despite all the progress we've made, we're losing. We have to admit this, we're losing. In the lead up to the federal election, in just the first half of the election campaign, the Liberal government made 95 micro-announcements for $1.3 billion in funding for marginal seats, with funding for projects like new football club change rooms, new netball courts, fixing phone black spots, etc. Now, if you want to ask most politicians about freedom of speech, they'll go, new netball stadium. If you ask them about a budget deficit, you'll be told, well, to get a new road, they use taxpayer money, our money, to buy votes, and they don't care about the issues. And this was just the Liberals, who are apparently our small government party. And we laugh because we read something like $360,000 of taxpayer money to design a coffee cup, $20,000 for an poetry slam for public servants, $10,000 for Tinder for dogs. This was something I just pulled up for the last few days, and we laugh. Funny. But it's actually not funny. This is immoral. People work hard and have their money stolen from them to buy votes. This is an insult, and it is outrageous, and is fundamentally immoral and morally abhorrent. This is using taxpayer funds to buy an election. Just think about this. If somebody, did a deal in the private sector for this, they'll be in jail for corruption. But how is it not a scandal that our political classes use taxpayer dollars to buy elections and don't go to jail? This is fundamentally abhorrent. What, you take money from a company? That's illegal. But if you take money from everyone through taxes and use it to buy 2 seats, that's somehow okay? People work hard for a living. There are a lot of people out there who genuinely, physically work hard for a living. And the fact that we are taking their money and using it to buy a marginal seat is something that should disgust everyone. And when we're laughing about the $10,000 for Tinder for dogs, we should actually think about the person who actually worked hard to take that money. We also see the fact that, the IPA came out with a research study recently that red tape costs the Australian economy $176 billion a year. Look at the fact that our outdated labour market regulations throttle businesses. Spending is going out of control. If you actually look at the spending projections in the intergenerational reports, by 2050, even assuming there are no new spending commitments, by 2050 we're going to have to increase taxes to the point where Stalinist Lee Rhiannon will look like a raging extremist right-winger. We're looking at needing to triple our tax rate just to pay for current spending because of the blowouts in health and education. And what's been done about it? Who in our political class is tackling the issues? The Liberals certainly aren't. They might be spending things differently, but if you look at any of their spending projections, at a federal level, they haven't really made the case. And I say this as someone who was very involved in the Liberal Party for many years and has a lot of great affection for it. But here's the thing, and here's where I'm probably going to get slightly controversial. We can blame bad politicians all we want. We can blame the media, we can blame the ABC, blame PC culture, whatever. And yeah, they're partially false. But really, winners don't make excuses. For us to simply say it's the fault of a bad politician, it's the fault of a biased media, is a cop-out. And it's a cop-out that I will not accept. Because the problem is that we have failed in making our case. We have failed to convince other people of the righteousness of our action. Our policies have led to the greatest flourishing we have ever seen in human history. And yet we have not convinced anyone for it. And now we have a case where the forces of big government have a powerful emotional narrative. They are once again coming out and saying, we will ensure you are secure, we will ensure you'll have jobs, we'll ensure you'll be provided for. Now we know that big government can't do this. It's always failed when it's tried and it's always led to misery and despair. But the allure, the temptation, it's still there. This allure has always been there through human history, culminating in the last century of the graveyards of over 100 million people through what the communists promised. My family members being buried in the graveyards of Russia because of it. We see in Venezuela politicians who Labour left were praising 2 years ago, creating a disaster where, and we laughed a year ago that, you read how there was a toilet paper in Venezuela and we all laughed. Toilet papers, ha ha ha. Today, you read today's newspaper, Venezuela has literally instituted a policy of forced labour camps. It's in today's newspaper. Venezuela has brought in essentially slavery as a result of their actions. Karl Popper, the philosopher, said, those who promise us paradise on earth never produced anything but a hell. And this is true. They try to, they say, we'll drag heaven and bring it down to earth. But in reality, they've dragged us down from earth and into hell. But the thing is, history has shown we don't have an endless march forward to all good things. If you were living in 1925, where was the most liberal, the most vibrant, the most fun, the most bohemian culture pro-gay rights, pro-voting, everything in the world. 1925, it was Berlin. Berlin in 1925 was the most socially and economically liberal place in the world. And look what happened 5 years after that. We don't have this onward march to freedom. So what do we need to do? We need to counter this vision of the left with our own positive vision. And I said we need our positive vision. Everyone agrees with me. Very easy. All we need to do is, if we can just make some really good YouTube videos, then we'll change everyone's mind. I just spoke to someone at a think tank and they were about this, and that's literally the answer that gave me. We're working on a YouTube program. Look, these are good tactics, and we're terrible at marketing. But what I'm going to now argue is that it goes beyond tactics and marketing. We need to recognise that people are hurting, people are scared, and we need to offer them our vision. And we need to offer them a vision which recognises that the policies we've promoted, while good for everyone, have created losers. And we need to recognise this. We don't want to give someone a policy prescription based on rational arguments about GDP growth, productivity enhancers, and marginal increase in output. I'm sorry, if you're going to go to anyone who's even remotely normal and tell them, well, you know, GDP increase, they're not going to care because people are swayed by emotion, not by reason. We're not going to win this by demonstrating how trade, while hurting some people, ultimately rationally leads to everyone else being better off in the long term. If you've just lost your job, you're struggling to put food on the table. If some snotty-nosed little kid comes up to you quoting Hayek about trade, who's never worked a day in his life, saying, well, yeah, but everyone's going to be better off, you're going to go tell them to get stuffed. And that's the trap that so many of us fall into. If we talk about Uber and digital currencies and how the blockchain will revolutionise everything, technology will be great. Yeah, look, that's nice if you're dealing with elite cosmopolitans. There is a real world out there that is greater than this. It was said at the conference today, 44% of jobs will be obsolete in 15 years. Well, that's nice, you know, technology is great, but what are we going to tell people in those professions to get them to vote for us? If we simply go out and continue with the mindset, as we as a movement have been doing for the last 30 years of, well, it's better for everyone, and don't factor in the needs of the losers, you're going to see what we're seeing in the US with the rise of the Trump campaign, and what we see with the disaffected voters in Australia now. We need to seriously create a vision and an alternative which recognises these needs. One that taps into the Australian psyche, our spirit of self-reliance, perhaps what made us great. And as I said, recognise that our policies create losers. In the US, in fact, and I do want to stress this because I don't think we understand enough the policies we champion, that we like, and I believe in completely, create losers. In the US, mortality rates for middle-aged white Americans have increased since the turn of the millennium. Just think about this. Mortality rates have increased, fueled by suicide, drug overdoses, liver disease, heart disease, diabetes. There are towns in the Midwest in the US where more than a third of working-age men are employed fewer than 20 hours a week. While everyone in US politics focuses on microaggressions, trans bathrooms, and trigger warnings, you have, for the first time in 150 years, where life expectancy is going downwards. This is pretty sobering stuff. Now, I think 95% of this is caused by failures with big government policies. But our opponents have a very, very simple answer, is that blame these people. Blame them. We need to counter that, and we haven't been doing that successfully. Where many of us who will be in this room have benefited from the rising prosperity that the global world has given us. The cosmopolitan international elites. And we're just thinking about those who have not. And Jonathan Haidt, who has written about moral psychology, considerably has made this comment quite clear. Those of us who benefit do really, really well. That we become essentially different people and part of a different class to the people who lose. Those of us facing existential pressures of survival, threats and challenges, they're not going to have the same views of an open economy as the cosmopolitan elites will do. And ironically, that the benefits that democratic capitalism has brought many of us has led many others in the opposite direction. And we argue, health and education. They deal with health and education on a daily basis. Now, they've been told, a complete lie about the government's ability to solve these problems. but we're not explaining why they're not right. People still think that if you're on the right wing of policies, you're anti-health, anti-welfare, anti-education, which is a load of bollocks. But we're not tapping into their emotions and explaining how we think it's going to be provided better if it's provided differently, and we need this vision. Now, one of the most influential people in Australian politics, who most of you would never have heard of, was Bert Kelly. Bert was a member of Parliament briefly, a minister, and he revolutionised public policy in Australia. He was responsible pretty much single-handedly for the New Right, to some people like John Hyde and others. Gough Whitlam, not somebody who I would normally quote, but Gough Whitlam said, quote, "No private member has had such an influence in changing a major policy of the major parties as Bert Kelly." Now, he was a farmer, and he was passionately opposed to our trade policy at the time because it created a situation where government granted favours to people it liked and not to others. He thought this was morally abhorrent, and he fought against it and changed the revolutionised the Liberal Party because of it. And he did it in two ways, through humour, through satire on one hand, but showing a vision of the world of the future, which is a dead vision. And this is what Reagan did with the shining city on the hill. It's what Menzies did with the forgotten people. It was this vision that was created. And we need to understand that people think differently. The fact that you're in this room and listening to politics means you're different to most people. And again, I'll go back to Hyde, and I'm not going to keep going because I'm already need to start wrapping up soon, and I'm far away from my conclusion of my speech. But John Hyde came up with moral foundations theory from the field of moral psychology. He had these different underlying moral principles and foundations that people believe care harm, liberty, oppression, fairness, cheating. And the key finding was that different people give different priorities to one moral foundation over another. Is caring more important? Is liberty more important? Is equality more important? What are the values? If we simply talk about economic rationality, you're ignoring the 80% of the population who believe another value is more important. What we need is, again, start thinking about other people. But other than simply creating a vision, we need to act on it. So moving away from vision and practical actions. Politicians respond to incentives. Public choice theory, those who were at the public choice seminar yesterday would know this. And simply swaying one person to vote different in an election doesn't really make that much of a difference. What we need to do is create a situation where politicians realise that it's in their incentive to do this. We need to incentivise politicians to do the right thing. I.e., you'll lose your seat if you don't do what the right thing to do is. And this is why the ATO was created, to create these constituents so that we can band together peer pressure. But also for those of you who are members of a political party here, it also applies in pre-selections. They need to know if they don't start doing the right thing, they'll lose their job. The second thing is, now this might seem a no-brainer, but apparently 95% of politicians, especially in the Liberal Party, don't realise it. It's a pretty bad idea to fund your enemies. Now, again, not really thinking that this should be that controversial, but every single time a political politician goes out and says we're going to give this $10,000 to a so-called non-government organisation that's not really non-government because it gets 100% of its funding from the government, and all it does is campaign for more taxpayer funding, this isn't strategically smart.